So I do not see the captioning yet. All right, well, you're good to go if you would like to get started still.
Thanks so much, Yolanda. Welcome, everybody. I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Steele Wagstaff. I am the product manager at Pressbooks, and I wanted to acknowledge at the beginning of this that I am joining you remotely from the traditional homeland of the Kalapuya peoples in Eugene, Oregon. And the panel today, if you are joining us, it's called Being the First, Experiences of OER Early Adopters and Creators. And I'm really pleased to welcome such a illustrious guest of panelists who are going to talk about a lot of things about getting started with OER at various levels of experience and various identity positions in the university. So the three panelists we have today, the first is Becca Cyprian. Hi, Becca. She's a German instructor in the World Languages Department at Boise State University. Together with a colleague, she's produced a distinctive grammar edition to accompany Deutsch im Blick. I'm not sure if my German pronunciation is good, which was a previously existing OER textbook for German language learners. Second panelist is Brandon Lowry. Brandon is an undergraduate student majoring in biomedical science at Colorado State University. He was recently elected the Associated Students of Colorado State University's Director of Academics and has been prominently involved in initiatives to further equity, diversity, and inclusion and promote the use of OER within the Colorado State system. And our third panelist is Farhad Dastur. He is a psychology instructor at Kwantlen Polytechnic University in Vancouver, Canada. He's been a longtime advocate for and champion of many forms of openness in education. He was an Open Education Group Research Fellow in 2016 and 2017, and he has published research on the efficacy of open versus print textbooks and is currently developing H5P interactive learning activities for an open social psychology textbook. So welcome to the three of you, and welcome to all of you who are joining us. If anyone wants to say briefly, the first, I guess just say hello and provide your land acknowledgement if you'd like.
I can go first. Hi, I'm Becca. I'm in outside of Boise, Idaho. Like Still said, I teach German, but I also teach a freshman seminar. I am coming from the traditional homeland of the Shoshone-Paiute tribe. And I am excited to be here and talk about OER because it's my new passion.
Thanks, Becca. We'll go to Brandon next.
Hey y'all, my name's Brandon Lowry. I use he, him, and his pronouns, and I'm coming to you from the traditional homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute Nations in Fort Collins, Colorado. I'm a biomedical sciences major concentrating in anatomy and physiology, and my future career path is hopefully going to be centered in creating pedagogy that'll dismantle systemic forms of oppression. Really happy to be here and chat with you all.
Thank you. Farhad?
Good day, everyone. I'm really excited to be a part of this event and to be sharing the stage with my esteemed panelists. I'm in Vancouver, Canada, and Kwantlen Polytechnic University derives its name from the Kwantlen First Nation. It means tireless runner, and we are committed to working with all First Nations with respect and trust. Our 5 campuses are located on many traditional territories, including the Kwantlen, the Katsi, the Kikite, the Coquitlam, the Musqueam, the Semiahmoo, and the Tsawwassen peoples. So thank you for that introduction, Steele.
Thanks. So I'm really excited because a lot of the people that are joining us are at various levels of involvement with open education. And the question I wanted to get started with is to talk a little bit about your story or your experience briefly. Everybody here has their own story about how they became interested in open education and the story of why they stayed engaged, why they got hooked. Sometimes the poll begins with wanting to reduce financial barriers to education and the realization that OER are free. Sometimes it flows from a teacher's desire to personalize and adapt materials for their students as individuals. Other times it's rooted in the joy of co-creating knowledge and building something with other people. And in other cases, it's sustained by that desire to address structural injustice or activist commitments to equity, inclusion, and access. In keeping a turn, would you tell us about what or who drew you into open education and what keeps or who keeps you there?
I'll jump in. I'm sorry. I don't have a problem talking. So in languages, I've been talking for, I don't know, 10, 15 years about creating my own textbook because Students, I didn't use the traditional textbook very often in the classroom. I used it just as kind of an outline for what the materials that I needed to go over, and the concepts and ideas that I wanted to teach as part of introductory German. So I've been talking about it for a really long time with colleagues and on my own and thinking about it. But what really drew me into this is that in our department, we have the Pathways Project, which is an open resource for educators in Idaho, language educators in Idaho. And so I really got involved in creating materials, not textbook materials, but lesson materials for a lot of our remotely situated colleagues in Idaho, because we are kind of an awkward state, and a lot of them are maybe the only language teacher at their school. So I started there, and then there was a project, a fellowship through the Idaho State Board of Education that I applied for and won, and it's called the OPAL Project. So Open Pedagogy, Advocacy, and Leadership. And as part of that, I was able to really figure out, well, what is it going to take to create something that I can use in the classroom that I find valuable and that my students find valuable, and more importantly, will support their learning and be free, of course. And without that fellowship, an 18-month fellowship, and the support and the collaboration, there would have been no way that I would have been able to really start. I had no idea how do I start. So that's how I got really cemented in, was through that fellowship that I received.
Brandon or Farhad, either of you want to take this next? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I can jump in. My OER journey started in 2019 when I was at the Community College of Aurora working as the president of Student Government Association. And I was approached by an instructor, Mandy Geddes, and a library administrator, Daniel Lawrence, who came to me to facilitate some listening sessions for students to uncover the need and the want for OER at the school. The main obstacle that those individuals were facing were administrators and faculty saying that students resisted OER, that we preferred print versus digital, and they needed help in just getting state of the art, if you will, with respect to the students. So we had some amazing conversations, heard a lot about how OER is a barrier of an access barrier with respect to cost. But what really got me involved and got me passionate about it was the idea that OER can be affordable and innovative, or affordable and inclusive. And that piece really stuck with me and resonated deeply with me, that the idea of reflecting identities in the content that we're presenting, and that we can change kind of these dominant narratives through OER. Yeah, I'll pause there.
Yeah, I'll jump in now. I think this is an important question to begin our discussion with. My journey, I think, began around 2014. And I can go into a lot of depth, but I won't. I think I was inspired by a few thought leaders within the movement, as well as at my own institution, people like Rajiv Jangiani, who now is our AVP of Teaching and Learning and All Things Open. And he really challenged our department to consider embracing open education. And luckily, we had a department that was very functional, a lot of good collegiality, and it made the conversation easy. Even though not a lot of people had adopted OER, but people were open-minded and curious, and I'll come back to that theme, I think, later on. For me, the draw is the philosophy of openness. It's just so much more organic, it's more flexible, it's more adaptable than the commercial textbooks and resources that we have available, and that most of us, experienced going through graduate school and undergrad. So to me, open education is this plea to educators to share knowledge, to create knowledge, to co-create it with other collaborators within the discipline, outside the discipline, to involve students in that collaborative process. It's about replication, it's about modification, it's about integration. In many ways, I see the open education ecosystem today as the metaphor for the Earth's ecosystems, a place where genetic material is shared and replicated and iterated as it adapts to local environments. I think the parallels are quite deep. And I've always resonated to ecological ways of thinking. And so for me, it felt right, even though I had questions, even though I had my biases as a scholar, as a critical thinker. Is this as good as, what are the limitations? But those are the natural questions that any scholar has towards any question. And there are appropriate questions, right? So, when I encounter colleagues today who are skeptical or resistant, I first want to acknowledge that that's fine, and then have a deeper conversation about what are the sources of your skepticism. Are you in principle open to thinking about this and changing your mind, or is it a deeper bias? So it's been a long journey. I can tell you that our institution has come a long way. We still have areas that are resistant, and that's true for all institutions. But there are things that people can do at their individual level, at their department level, and at their institutional level to really move this project forward.
That's a great kind of segue to maybe the thing I wanted to ask next. And I noticed in both what you said, Farhad, and what you were saying, Brandon, that there were people that began with misconceptions or that begin with the position of skepticism. I think that's pretty normal in academia. And Becca, you also talked about like having a fellowship that helped you be introduced to something that you hadn't done before. I think there's a lot of people on this call. The question that we hear the most often is, I'm just getting started. There's nobody else in my institution doing this, or like I'm alone out there doing this, or I'm interested in this, but where do I begin? So I would say the context for this question is that being an early adopter or a practitioner at an academic institution is a lonely road at times. And this has been especially true during the pandemic when people feel even more isolated. How have you found or built community either inside or outside of your institution while working on an open textbook project or advocating for open education? Are there organizations, communities, or practices that you would recommend to other people who are feeling like they're interested in this but feel a bit alone right now, or that don't have collaborators at their school that they can work with easily?
Well, I'll jump in. I'll go first. So it can be alone. I think the biggest, I want to piggyback on what Farhad was just saying, is that I think that there's a huge misconception and maybe even a bias here about what open education even is, and what it means to create something that's open. And I think that one of the biases is that it's just is founded in, well, if it's open, it's not real. Like it doesn't follow through all of the, it doesn't have an editing process. It doesn't have, reviewers. It just is your information. It's just stuff that you're writing in there or that you're creating. And I think that's a huge bias. And then about collaboration, I'm really lucky in world languages. I think that world language teachers are already like really open and natural collaborators. But I would really encourage folks to reach out to, we have a Center for Teaching and Learning, and at most institutions there's something like that. And see if they can like organize a workshop about, well, what is open education? What does it mean when I'm working with an OER? Because OER is really wide ranging. It can be anything really. And the next step for me is my collaborators are going to be my students. Like I want them to help me create what they want to see in their materials and their textbooks. And I think that there are some disciplines that, I want them to be the experts at the end of any course. So I want them to help me create materials. And I think that would be a great way to kind of, to figure out. So CTL, Center for Teaching and Learning, help me learn. And then, don't underestimate students, the power that students have in creating open resources for themselves and for your course, but also for future students.
Maybe Brandon, you want to speak to that a little bit? Becca mentioned students, and you've also worked on student government, which is often cross-institutional. Talk a little bit about that building community across or movement across many schools?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, OER is about equity, and equity is about social justice and transformation. If you haven't heard the words OER on your campus, hopefully you've heard dismantling some form of oppression or acknowledging identity within these spaces. I think those are good people to start, because ultimately that conversation can be removed from being so focused on OER and saying, you know, this is about structural change. When I started onboarding for this position, one of the first questions that I asked, thankfully I was able to find an answer, was who was doing the OER work on campus. And the library, similarly to the Community College of Aurora, were the folks who were doing the OER initiatives and really pushing for it. The library support was already there at CCA. And I think there's something inherently open about a library. It's not surprising to me that many folks who manage them are open to access. So I would say, you know, a library is a great place to start. And then maybe power mapping, looking to see what identity groups on your campus are specifically impacted through this, and then moving from there.
Farhad, you've had experience both at institutional level, but even working across institutions on a research fellowship and forming partnerships outside your institution. What were the organizations or practices that you found most helpful?
Yeah, great question, Steele. There are so many organizations right now, and you know, to connect to an organization where everyone gets it, where everyone is singing from the same songbook, that's astonishing. Because at your institution level, of course, you're sometimes the only person in a committee or a department. But there are many there's the open education conferences now at you know, universities host them. They're at the state level, the provincial level, national, international level. So really find the one that speaks to you and that you can get to. There are online repositories for open education resources. I think of Merlot, which is a fantastic resource. You all got to check it out if you haven't. NOBA, OpenStax. In my own province, BC Campus has done some fantastic work working with Pressbooks in putting up open education textbooks that are freely accessible, and many workshops, not only on open education, but the pedagogies that support and are in alignment with open education. So Brandon mentioned, you know, EDI initiatives, right? And thinking about introducing those principles, thinking of universal design for learning, or indigenization, or multicultural perspectives in our teaching. And there's a nice resonance where open education resources can accommodate many of these non-traditional perspectives that are becoming much more mainstream. You can update your book, you can internationalize it, you can make it local to your circumstances. Something that a commercial textbook can't do, won't do, have never done. It's been the one issue, you know, with all due respect to my American friends, it's usually the American edition. And then we have to kind of say, well, let's Canadianize it, or let's Indianize it, or whatever the word is. And, you know, you can now create the version that is unique for you, and meet shifting changes in the landscape. The other point I wanted to make, and I think Becca mentioned the Campus Center for Teaching and Learning, or it goes by various iterations, and they are a very important group that you need to work with. They are natural allies. They have resources. They come from the same, they drink the same water. And Brandon mentioned the library, and I have exactly the same experience at my institution, where the librarians are some of the leaders in our institution and across. And it's strange. I'll sometimes go to an open education conference, and our librarians are there, and I didn't even know they were going to be there presenting. So definitely embrace and hug your librarian. But you know, the level of analysis that I think has been missing when we've been talking about resistance to change is at twofold, right? And the first is the institution itself, which are typically very resistant to change. And I don't think people realize that, because very often the branding and the marketing messages and the current language is about agility and innovation and all of these buzzwords. But I think people have to remember, you know, the first university was the University of Bologna. It was started in 1088. And so universities have been around for almost 1,000 years. Only the Catholic Church is older as an institution that hasn't really changed much. And if you look at the administrative structures, the governance models, the hierarchical organization of the university, look at the architecture of your own campus. It's usually an architecture of stability, large buildings, stone, except for the newer computer science building and things like that, right? But the traditional campus reflects this entrenched view that is resistant to change. It sounds strange to hear that. So you have to understand that when you're trying to advocate for openness at your institution, while yes, you can find allies and these centers that are going to help you, primarily the institution is not designed or set up in its DNA to do that. It will resist you. And it's not just because there's commercial interest, it's that there's a resistance to new ways of doing things, right? So for the faculty member, your unit of change should be your department. That's the place that you find home and where you have a voice and you can legitimately start to carry this ball forward. I have more to say about that, but I'll let us, go on in
Awesome.
the questions.
So I love everything that people have been saying. We put a bunch of links in the chat. Thank you for those ideas. I think what we're talking about is a range of different kind of levels of engagement. There can be the level of engagement for the students who are saying, hey, this is a change we'd like to see in terms of our financial expenditures over the course of our undergraduate career, or this is what I want class materials to look like for me as an instructor. There's instructors who are saying, I teach a bunch of courses. I want to do this new thing. It feels a bit lonely. I can find people on campus who are allies, or I can actually work with my students. That's a great cure for loneliness, Becca was suggesting. And then Farhad's talking a little bit more about thinking about structural institutional change, or thinking about the department as a place for transformation in practices and even approach to curricula in a department. So the question I want to say is, each of you at one point were early champions of open education, whether it was on your campus or in your class or in your department or more broadly. What have you learned about coalition and alliance building on your campus? What did or didn't work, or what has and hasn't worked when it came to building administrative support for the grassroots open education efforts that you were involved with at your institution?
At the beginning, I think I was trying to engage everyone at every moment of every day. And that was really quite taxing. And as far as stamina, was not going to work out for me. I really focused, I think, on the quantity of folks in my corner, as opposed to the quality or what the stories or what they were wanting to share, or what they were passionate about. So now I try to build coalition with as much as intentionality as possible. Because I've realized that OER is a long battle. It's important to be very explicit when inviting people into this work about what your expectations are of them and what our expectations are for the school, for the university. As far as communities, I think I would recommend engaging the organizations, again, that support marginalized identity groups. I think that allows for a better understanding of the impact. I think when we only engage students who are steeped in privilege, the majority of students, we eliminate the possibility for equitable treatment.
I'll jump in here if that's okay, Becca. So I look at how change happens at the organization. And, Wallace has this model called a diffusion of innovation adoption curve. It was originally developed for introducing new types of seed to farmers, I believe in Idaho, in fact, if I'm not mistaken. But it actually, it applies to all kinds of organizations where a disruptive idea or technology or service is trying to, gain foothold. And so you have these types of categories amongst people for various sociological and psychological reasons. Some people are just naturally innovators. I think Becca and Brandon are examples of that, right? You're not going to wait for your institution to tell you to do something. You're going to be leading the institution. You're going to be way out ahead of the pack. And I think most people at this event are in that category, or they might be what would be called early adopters. Not necessarily the high risk taking innovators who have to put in a lot of time and effort, but the ones who watch that there's a change happening and they're curious about it. They want to experiment with it. They want to try it out at low stakes. So what I would say is find these two groups at your institution who seems to be, in general, because of their personality and their track record, adopting new ideas, new technologies, new ways of curriculum, pedagogy, etc., and form coalition with them, because they have the constitution and the mindset and the skill set to push through bureaucratic hurdles, to push through resistance, etc. But the actual group that you want to convince is the next group on this diffusion of adoption curve, and they're called early adopters or early majority users. And they represent maybe 30% of the institution, typically. These people are open to change, but they need evidence, and they need to be made easy for them to adopt. So in our own department, we started an open education committee made up of a few people who had respect within the department. They had some gravitas, they had street cred, and they made recommendations. And one of the biggest things we did was break the stranglehold of the monopoly that the commercial textbook had on our introductory psychology classes, which are the largest class on our campus and typically at many classes, because everyone takes intro psych and English as your first year elective. And what initially all classes had to be taught with the same textbook. And we then just opened that decision to saying it was the instructor's choice to use an open textbook or the commercial textbook. And that little change, which was owned by the department, it wasn't an edict that came from the dean's office or from the vice president, it came from bottom up. And it wasn't too scary because the people who are like late majority, who just resist change because they're scared of it, weren't their position wasn't threatened in at least not yet, right? But they were able to continue business as usual. And your early majority and your early adopters were able to say, finally, we have some breathing room, let's try this out. And then we report back to the department about our experiences. So this is how the conversation happens at the level of organization where I think most faculty, sorry, Brandon, students aren't typically involved in departments, although we involve our students in our department meetings. That's where you can affect change. That's where you can feel it's authentic. That's where you can feel efficacy, that you have control over it. And then you can start to find your allies in administration, and of course across the institution, library, Center for Learning, and indeed across, in the national organizations that are about this project. So
that was super trenchant and I think very practical for our listeners. Is there anything you wanted to add, Becca, on this question?
Well, I feel like I'm maybe one of the early adopters here because the trend here, I mean, there's our legislature is pushing OER in all levels of education, K through 12 and higher education. And our campus is very open and supportive. So I don't feel like I have any, I haven't had felt any pushback. I'm like, congratulated and, set as the example. But one thing that I would say is, start in your department. Right. And what Farhad said here with you can use it or not, give instructors the opportunity. And then you have that evidence that students are still learning the same material and can produce the same, for me, language with an open education textbook versus a traditional textbook will help that last third kind of move over to the open education side. Like I said, we have a lot of instructors and professors and faculty members working with open education at our campus. So I feel very lucky that it isn't. I don't feel any pushback from most folks.
So we had a really nice comment in the chat from Emily who says, finding people motivated to do the work is powerful. I have a colleague who substantively updated an open nutrition book that's now used for all sections of intro nutrition, and she gave a link to that book. Earlier in the chat, there was a question from Aziz who was saying, so creating a new book is somehow different from making an open textbook. There was some confusion about that. So the question I want to ask is, so if you look at if I'm thinking about, I want to write an introduction to psychology textbook, I take one of those existing books off the shelf and I'm like, wait, this is 800 pages and has 45 contributors. And I think I might want to make a difference, but the idea of creating a massive open textbook by myself from scratch, that's terrifying. It's so daunting that most of us would be like, I'm going to give up before I begin. But open licenses, on the other hand, if something has an open license, it means it's already been published and it allows anyone to revise it, remix it, to reuse it at no cost. That they explicitly encourage us to revise, remix, or adapt things that already exist. Can you tell us a little bit, this is mainly, I guess, for Farhad and Becca, can you tell us about your experiences finding open content that you could adopt or adapt, and what your experiences were working with something that already existed instead of creating from scratch? Because that's something that not everybody on this chat is familiar with and knows what it looks like.
Yeah, I'll jump in first because that's what my project was in my fellowship. Is I remixed an existing OER text, and I'm like I said, I feel like I'm lucky with my discipline is that there is a whole center for open educational resources and language learning. It's the center is at University of Texas in Austin, and they have all of their materials are CC4, which is just. You can remix, you can use, you can adapt, you can change whatever you want. And I've been working with their materials for a really long time. And that was always the barrier for me, was like, oh my gosh, I don't even know where to start. This is so daunting, this huge project. How do I create everything? And what if it is, copyrighted and what if something I do create is misused? But being able to have this foundation and then just change what I update and create new activities. And I also work with H5P, which is also an open platform, and being able to remix and create something and adapt to what I think will work best for me was the aha moment in this whole process for me. Is there would have been no way that I would have been able to create what I did because of the barriers that I have. I can't do that, but I can remix something that I think, oh yeah, I'll change this to here and I'll keep that and I'll do whatever I want to it, and make it my own, and then it has become our own.
Yeah, Steele, I think there's two ways to think about this. The first is, addressing that daunting challenge of writing the definitive textbook in your field, right? And, the NOVA approach is an interesting one. So I use this in psychology, and what they have done is they have reached out to the leading researchers and scholars in psychology, and each of them writes a module on their area. And then it's packaged together as an introduction to psychology. And then you're free to, not only choose which module you use, but the issue of reputation is immediately addressed, because the authors of these modules are the people you have been referencing all, in your discipline. You can take that approach and bring it down. So if you have a large enough department, or if you have colleagues in other departments in your discipline, why not write your own textbook using that modular approach? So each of you take 1 or 2 modules. That's doable. You can probably get funding from your institution or from one of the open education organizations. It could be a time release to release you from a course, or maybe a certain amount of money as compensation, because you're not going to get royalties, right? I think we do need to recognize there is a commitment of work and effort in creation of OER, including adaptation and the other forms. But it doesn't have to be the all or nothing model that I think a lot of faculty were raised with. Either I'm a world-renowned scholar and I'm going to write that book, or I can't and I won't. The second thing I would say is that, we in the project I'm working on right now, we started with a social psychology textbook written for the American population by Charles Stangor, published with Pressbooks. Rajiv Jangiani and my colleague Hammond Terry at my institution then adapted it and made it into an international edition. And then I and Hammond Terry are adding and integrating the H5P open learning assignments and assessments and activities into the international edition. So, you know, you break it down and you integrate and you work on a level of the book or the resource or the practice that is manageable and that is valuable to you and that you can then immediately, you know, see benefit from. So you know, I think psychologically, what openness allows when you recognize all the ways that you can enter that field is it lowers that risk bar and that psychological barrier that says, I don't have the time, money, expertise, or energy to do that.
Thank you so much. The thing that I was dreading that was going to happen, it just happened. I lost connection briefly, but I'm back. Hopefully you can all hear me still. Oh, okay. There was a question from Aziz that says, can you use some portion of non-OER textbooks in OER texts you are changing and adapting, and how? So this is a kind of a complicated question, Aziz. You may want to ask librarians on your campus, but the answer generally is that yes, if you're using something that has what's called a fair use provision. So copyright law allows people to make fair use of copyrighted material in lots of different ways. So the answer is a qualified yes. I can't give you specific answers about your particular copyright situation, but usually if you have access to a scholarly publishing or a copyright librarian, they can probably advise or consult with you on this, or we could point to some references where you could self-educate and decide what you feel comfortable with. Yeah. Then the next question that we wanted to ask everybody is, I guess I want to kind of jump to this question about, let's imagine you could go back in time and talk to yourself, say 2 or 3 years ago when you were getting started on this journey, or 10 years ago, Farhad, when you were getting started on this journey. What would you tell your past self to avoid doing in relation to open education? What would you tell your past self to do more of? What would you tell your past self, hey, you should try? And is there anything that your past self you think really especially would have needed to hear, knowing what you know now?
Well, I'll jump in. I keep going first. I would have just pushed myself into it. I had no idea what open meant, really. I thought it was just, you know, a textbook on the web. And since being involved in this fellowship and also just, we have a lot of OER creators in our department, and the conversations that I've had with folks at Rebus, which you put in the post earlier, and I would have just pushed myself into it earlier and just done something, you know, just started working on something. And I also would have involved my students earlier. I think that that's a great way to kind of, Brandon's, you know, talking about equity and breaking down power systems. And I think that's a really great way to do that, is to show that they have value in their education and that they can create and that they can be involved in the process. That's something I'm just starting now, and definitely 2 years ago I would have included students, and you know, 10 years ago I would have said just jump in and figure out what it is and find some people, find folks that are willing to help and be collaborators and readers, and just to have a conversation about it. That I would have definitely pushed myself into it earlier.
I would avoid coupling the definition of OER with low cost or just affordable. I think I don't think something can truly be open access if there's a cost associated with accessing it. So I think that was one of the mistakes that I made kind of early on, is joining these conversations and saying, well, low cost sounds good too, instead of really pushing for the open access piece. I would hope to do more of, I would not be afraid to ruffle feathers. OER will likely be met with resistance, regardless of how nicely I've asked. So explicitly naming why we need it and how institutions are getting it should be, I think, the mainstay of the conversation. For me personally, that's, I think, what I would like to have done differently.
I think for me, I would have told my students what I was doing and why I was doing it earlier, rather than just say, here's an open education resource. And really told them, look, I'm experimenting and I'm going to get some things wrong. And this textbook is going to have some errors in it. And I want you to find them so that we can let the author know, and they will change it in real time, which is astonishing because in a commercial textbook, I also tell them to find the errors, but then I have to let the next generation know, hey, my past class found this error. With the open textbook, there it is. The modification has been changed and it's been tracked and so on. And that's incredible. The other thing I would echo Becca's comment, just don't be afraid and jump in, explore more, experiment more. There's this motto that comes out of Silicon Valley, right? Fail fast, fail often in order to succeed. And so not to be afraid of doing those kinds of things, but letting people know. And some of it depends on your personality. I'm more naturally an introvert. That may not be obvious in a session like this. I'm a situational extrovert, but after this session, I'm going to need to go decompress. So in some senses, it's harder for someone like me to reach out and find those collaborators, especially if I don't know them and going outside of the institution. How do you do that, right? But having done it, you realize that there are these extraordinary people out there who are like-minded and like-hearted, and have done things and want to collaborate and are experiencing similar problems, and there's community in that. And I think that's what I would sort of end my answer by saying there is this kind of global community of open education advocates, champions, people who are curious, many different places and levels, obviously, but they all share something in common, and that is to make education accessible and to make it work for people and for students, and to make it something that it should have always been, because that was what drew us to education in the first place. It was not to lock into these commercialized systems, but it was to share your passion for your discipline, to share knowledge. That's why we became educators, and open education allows you to do that. So to me, it's obvious.
I feel like standing up and applauding at this point. Like I think so. I don't want to speak too much about myself, but I would say that deeply resonates with my own personal experience. Like involvement with open education has changed my career, it's changed my life. And I don't usually like attending academic conferences. My subject training was in English literature, and I'd go to these literary scholar conferences and I'd be like, oh, wow, these questions don't actually end in question marks. And it's a bunch of academic preening and things like that. And I'm like, okay, I tolerate it in my field. But when I started attending open education conferences, I found a spirit of generosity and sharing. And I found a community that felt at home for me. And I think that that's something that I mean, everybody's attending one right now that's being organized in the state of Colorado. But I have really found a welcoming, inclusive community for me in open education. And I suspect that there are many people that are looking for like-minded, like-hearted people to work on together. And I think I would just underline that point. Ask, look for collaborators and ask. And hopefully that makes the work a bit lighter. Becca was talking about languages, and I think you look at languages, and that's one of those places where collaboration is strongest and open education is really thriving, because I think teachers in education or in languages tend to think of language as a common resource that belongs to everyone, and we want to share that language to keep it alive. Okay, so the last question that I wanted to pose to this group is kind of a conceptual question or maybe an advice question. So there was a very prominent declaration where a bunch of international activists got together in Cape Town, South Africa, and they published what they called the Cape Town Open Education Declaration. That's almost 15 years ago. And about 10 years later, another group came together and reflected on those, and they identified what they saw were 10 key directions to move open education forward. Several of those directions were things that have been important to you, that you've talked about, things like empowering the next generation, the student activists and people that are coming up now. Connecting with other open movements outside of education, whether it's open software, open data, or open government, or things like open pedagogy, which Becca talked about addressing and being passionate about, or things that both of Becca and Farhad talked about, moving beyond the textbook to interactive components or to media. Those were some of the things that they identified as directions for moving forward. The question I want to pose for each of you is, in your opinion, what is one thing that those of us who are working in the open education community could do a better job of that we might be overlooking right now, or that you've noticed that we might not be paying enough attention to?
I really think it is advocacy and educating people what OER truly is. And I'm coming from that from my perspective, because when I jumped into this journey, I had no idea what it meant. And to hear, a student, Brandon, saying, equity and dissolving of power systems, and that's what open education resources are, and where the path should be heading with it. And I didn't know that a couple of years ago. The advocacy and the education part, and just talking about it. And Brandon, you did say that, quality versus quantity. I disagree. I want to tell everybody what it is, and especially the folks in the legislature, in my legislature, that are pushing for it. Like, they don't truly understand what open education is. I want the quantity. So that's where my path is kind of going. I'm still creating and working, but I feel like I need to be in the advocacy. I need to be in the education of folks at institutions, and especially legislatures, people that are in control of the money to help folks, kind of create this stuff.
I think the one that stood out to me is the one that I struggle with the most, or have struggled with the most, as far as thinking of OER. And it's thinking of it outside of the institution. So I'm getting ready to graduate within a year. And as I progress into new territory, I'm curious as to what access barriers are present in those spaces. I think OER really benefits the students who are able to get into college. What about all the students who aren't able to access an education? So I think that's the one for me. I certainly think everyone here is doing a great job, because you're here, you're engaging in dialogue about this. So I think all of you are doing great. I think CSU could explicitly name it in our strategic plan. I think that would be a great start, but that's kind of specific to where I'm at.
Yeah, for me, I would say, using a Star Wars metaphor, are you on the side of the Empire or is the side of the rebels, right? Like, choose your side. And once you've chosen the right side, which is the rebels, of course, you'll realize you're part of a much bigger movement, right? We're talking about open education, but there's a movement of open science. There's an open data movement. There's an open government movement. There's open architecture, right? And they all share common themes and recurring principles. So there is a broader global social open movement that's happening. So find the path, that speaks to you, and then work on the area that you have some skill in, or that you want to develop skill in, and that you have passion and some natural talent in, perhaps. So while, yeah, you can either take the full front, every front approach that Becca wants to take, and we need people like that, or you want to be more focused and say, I'm just going to adapt one chapter in one textbook for one semester and see how that goes. Whatever works for you. And then you'll expand based on the feedback and the experience you have. But for me, I think where I'm interested in moving right now is, of course, supporting all the advocacy and other collaborations that are trying to shift the entire environment. I'm interested in helping that. But where I want to put my primary energy is in creating open activities, open learning objects. So this is where the integration of H5P, for example, in a textbook is important to me, because right now I think the open textbooks can be as good, or even in some cases better, than the commercial textbook. But where they are not as good is in the ancillaries, because we don't have $1 million budgets, and we can't hire the same kinds of people with graphics backgrounds and specialty technical skills to offer all of the other things that a textbook publisher can offer. And very often, my colleagues say, well, why would I go with an open textbook that has a couple of multiple choice questions, maybe, and a few links to videos, when the publisher is providing me with 10 different cutting edge, amazing technologies, adaptive learning, etc. And if we're going to compete at that level, we need to start creating those kinds of open learning activities.
I got booted from the meeting again, but I'm back. Hopefully the timing worked out okay. There may be a long awkward pause. I don't know, but okay. I wanted to just say thank you so much to Becca and Farhad and Brandon for joining us as a panelist. Thanks to all of you who came and joined this session and are participating in the COLTT conference. I think it's a really exciting time to be involved with open education. I mean, education is sharing, and we appreciate everything that people are doing to advance greater equity, greater access, and greater learning experiences for all the people that you serve and you work with. Again, I think the panelists can be contacted probably through whatever contact methods that they've offered if you have follow-up questions. We put a lot of information in the chat, and this session was recorded. Thank you again to our session host for facilitating and making it smooth. My apologies for dropping out there briefly. We really appreciate your time and attention and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much. And just so you know, still, we didn't realize that you had dropped out. So if you had not said anything, we would never have known. So thank you. I'm going to stop the recording. It was awesome.